this is why I'm such a fan of taking some space from all action. This is actually something I learned from Rick Rubin. I'm fortunate to call him a close friend. We communicate pretty much every day. And I went and spent a week with him abroad this summer. It was the worst time to travel. And I decided to go over to where he was in Europe and just spend the week with him. We had no plan. And first of all, on the way over there was nothing to watch on the plane, but there was this Tom Petty documentary. And I turned it on. I'm not a huge Tom Petty fan, but it was interesting enough. And then Rick is in the documentary. And he's in the documentary lying down doing the interview. Typical meaning unusual for most people, typical because it's unusual for Rick to be lying down. And I thought, okay, so get there. I know his family well and I love them. And it was really wonderful. It was beautiful. It's a beautiful part of Europe. But, I noticed, so we had this habit of we would tread water in the pool and listen to podcasts in the morning. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful podcast, by the way, that we should all be aware of. I think it's a History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs by Andrew Hickey. Super nerdy. It's like getting a graduate degree in rock and roll. It talks about the music, but also what's happening in organized crime, how it impacted record sales. Very contextual, very cool. I'm very into that lately. And and in this show on Netflix, have you seen Spy Ops?
Yes.
Very good, right? Because it's not just shoot 'em up type stuff. It's really about how spy operations, let me put it this way, it can teach you a lot about history, international history and geopolitical history. So I go over there and we do some treading water, listening to podcasts. I learn about this History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs podcast. We talk about it a little bit. And then I noticed that, Rick has a practice. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this because I'm about to. Rick has a practice. He has many practices, but one of them is he'll spend a good amount of time, just sitting and thinking or lying down and thinking. And it didn't occur to me at the time, but later, after I returned, I thought back to our first guest episode of my podcast. I hosted a guy named Carl Deisroth, who's probably the finest bioengineer on the planet. He's also a fully active clinician psychiatrist. He's got 5 children. He's one of these phenoms, that seems to be able to do everything. And he's a true genius. He went to school with medical school with Peter Attia and Paul Conti. They were all in the same class. Yeah. And I know him very well. He's a colleague of mine at Stanford, and everyone knows he's like the Michael Jordan of neuroscience, except he's still active. And that is not a statement about personality, just in terms of successful hit rate. And Carl described a practice that he does after he puts his kids to sleep, of where he deliberately sits completely still and forces himself to think in complete sentences. And this set off a light in my head when I realized Rick does a form of this and Carl does a form of this. If you read the new Elon Musk book, they talk about Elon doing a form of this. The great Richard Feynman, physicist, Nobel Prize winner, talked about going into flotation tanks and doing a form of this. Einstein did a form of this. So what are we talking about? So I'm a neuroscientist, but I'm certainly not as smart as any of those guys. What we're talking about is body still, mind active. Now, I've become increasingly curious about psychedelic therapies, one of which is, and by the way, only in a clinical context, et cetera, legality, et cetera, not in kids, et cetera. But the practice is essentially macrodose psilocybin, but with the eye mask on, completely still, mind very active. Okay, contrast that to a different behavior / protocol that I'm very familiar with, which is I like to do long runs or rucks on Sunday. Body very active, mind not directed at anything in particular. Sometimes I'll do it without a book or podcast. Sometimes I do it with a combination of both. Many people talk about swimming or in the shower or cycling, some sort of rhythmic movement, drumming. The great Joe Strummer was really big on campfires. I was going to mention this earlier, but I'll mention it now, that as an alternative to alcohol consumption, get your friends together around a fire. By the way, the light from fire does not disrupt the circadian system. This has actually been shown. Candlelight, moonlight, firelight, as bright as it is, it's just very low lux. So that's where great things happen, independent of alcohol, right? Around a campfire. It goes way back in our lineage. So there are these two states of mind and body that I find fascinating, to the point of being intriguing, to the point of having modified what I do now. because they are the inverse of one another. Body completely still or close to completely still, mind very active. Could be with psilocybin, but that's not the protocol I'm recommending. I'm talking about some very, very smart, extremely accomplished people who all did the same thing. The other is body very active. Mind isn't still, but is not deliberately channeled to any particular linear kind of story or something like that. There's a state in sleep where our body is literally paralyzed and the brain is extremely active. It's called rapid eye movement sleep. So I'm sort of raising a flag for this potential protocol / practice. I don't have any peer-reviewed science to support what I'm about to say, but I have enough examples of extremely accomplished people now in front of me to realize that there's something special about divorcing mind and body function temporarily, deliberately, sitting there and just thinking. And recently I had a conversation with the great Paul Conti, and the addition of the words "the great" in front of him are appropriate here. I believe, based on my observation of his clinical work and intellectual acumen, that he's the finest psychiatrist of our age, clearly integrating from so many backgrounds. He's worked with a ton of interesting people.
Coming on the podcast in December.
Amazing. And he's just phenomenal, right? Not just about trauma, but about everything, personality types, narcissism, gaslighting. I mean, people throw those terms around like crazy. Paul will tell you what it actually means, okay? What those terms actually mean. But the ability to think and to access the unconscious. Paul refers to the unconscious as the supercomputer of the brain. For the unconscious mind and the conscious mind are always in a dialogue. But here's the theory, here's the hypothesis, that when we bring our body into states of stillness in REM sleep, in these deliberate states that I just described, that these other people actively engage in and have for a long time, that the unconscious mind can start to take over a larger percentage of that conversation. And we have access to new ideas, new ways of structuring thought, et cetera. And I don't think one requires psilocybin to do it, but I do think that is one avenue into it.
Reliable.
That's reliable. It also carries certain hazards, right? Because it's like being put on a mental rocket ship to some extent. It's not like DMT, but very little control over where one's cognition goes, although there is some in there. Anyway, I just wanted to throw this up on the wall because it's always fun to talk about new things and kind of what's coming, what I think is coming next. I think if I were to make a prediction, I think in the next 2 years, you're not just going to hear about meditation, non-sleep deep rest, something I'm a big fan of, yoga nidra, hypnosis, but also whatever we want to call this, you'll probably come up with a better name than I can, body still, mind active states to access different aspects of our unconscious and cognition. And I must say that we do this with the phone. Sorry, I just, because I realized you were about to say something. And when you speak, you say interesting things. And I learned cosplay, LARPing.
Don't put those ones as the most interesting.
Oh, no, you say many interesting
stuff.
No, there's other, no, well, in terms of new terms.
Okay.
New terms.
Yeah.
Newcastle.
Yeah. Sunderland.
Sorry. Those weren't the most concepts, but I'm learning is the point. I wasn't being sarcastic. That when we sit and we're just scrolling, yeah, we're more or less body still, mind active, but guess what? None of it's coming from within. It's all coming from the outside. So whether or not it's psilocybin in the eye mask, or Carl sitting there, eyes closed, deliberately still thinking, or Feynman in the salt equilibration chamber, the flotation tank, or Rick lying there thinking whatever it is he happens to be thinking, whatever amazing album he's going to now help produce, or Einstein. I mean, we can think of the phone and the scrolling as lending itself to less ability to focus and ADHD, but just the real crime, the real insult to humanity, for me, the real cost is what about all the creative imagination of things that come from inside that could be generated by people in that time. So I've started doing a practice of 20 minutes a day of just sitting and eyes closed typically. Sometimes it's right as I wake up, but usually it's not. And just trying to think about certain topics and hold those topics in a kind of a linear way, or sometimes just letting stuff geyser up. Anyway, some people might think of this as like completely wacko-woo, new agey stuff, but the list of names I read off there of people that do that and have been doing this for a long time and attribute this practice as one of the major sources of their best ideas is a non-trivial list.
When I think about that, there's a few different ways that are slightly similar. The number of people who've had great ideas whilst walking, and attribute an awful lot of their success to walking and thinking.
Right.
I'm aware that you're talking body still, mind active, but it's like body mostly still. It's not exactly like...
Or perhaps there's a unique way to access this too. Maybe it's a different channel to a different brain state. Maybe it's a different channel to the same brain state. Like I love doing long rucks and long runs on Sunday. That's my goal on Sunday. Get out as much as possible into the nature and just move in some sort of repetitive way, like a mule. I'll throw on a rucksack because Peter Attia got me into that. Sometimes it's with other people, sometimes alone. Sometimes I listen to a podcast, sometimes I don't. Sometimes an audiobook, sometimes I don't. But something about motor repetition. So this is not sets and reps. This is not restacking the plate. This is, minimum amount of cognition required, freeing up mental space to do other things. Yeah, could be on the rower. So again, I think different people will do it differently. I've been hanging around with a lot of musicians lately. I've become good friends with one of my favorite musicians, songwriters, Tim Armstrong, lead singer for Rancid, Transplants. He and Travis Barker did Transplants. And, it's clear that musicians, especially drummers, but other musicians, well, they're always in a rhythm in their head. They're actually, Tim and I the other day, we went someplace and we walked out. He's like, did you hear that? I'm like, to hear what? He's like, you didn't hear that? I was like, what? He's like, they had the news on and the radio on, and he's so tuned into the audio environment. I'm not, right? I'm not that audio oriented, more visually oriented. But people who have an internal rhythm that they're noodling on something in their head. I mean, this is the substrate of creative work, right? And again, the phone isn't evil, but the moment you're taking in sensory input from that includes things that have already been created, you could argue that those are the macronutrients that you're going to combine for your own creative thing, the gems in the internet. So scientific studies for me are interesting things on YouTube. But there's also just the raw materials of creative work that come from limiting sensory input and just going inside.
Self-generating it. In other news, this episode is brought to you by Element. Element contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium that will help to regulate your appetite, curb cravings, and optimize your brain health. You do not need coffee first thing in the morning. Your adenosine system that caffeine acts on isn't even active for the first 90 minutes of the day, but your adrenal system is, and salt acts on your adrenal system. Best of all, it just tastes phenomenal. This orange flavor is honestly like a godly nectar that I've been taking every single morning for over 3 years. Even when I'm on the road out here in LA, it is the first thing that I reach for every single morning. Best of all, they have a no BS, no questions asked refund policy where you can buy it 100% risk-free. And if you do not like it for any reason, you can get your money back and you don't even need to return the box. That's how confident they are that you'll love it. Head to the link in the description below or go to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom to get a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip with Dr. Huberman, you will love the 3-hour episode that you can watch right here. Go on. Press it.